before class and stuff. But keep her in your prayers.
Oh, I will.
The crest jewel of discrimination. And we have if you want the chance, there's a Google Doc, is that what it's called?
Yeah, I posted it to the group.
It's posted to the group. So you can get the chance there. And I think I'm going to ask Aditi to post it on the Silent Way website so you can download them there and perhaps kind of get them in your mind and stuff like that. So last week, we spent most of our time on the first shloka. Shloka means a verse, the first verse, which is the salutation to Shankara's guru. His guru is a fellow named Govindapada. And we talked about how Govindapada's guru was Gaudapada, the one who wrote the great gloss on the Mandukya Upanishad. But then in that first verse, he opens up the highest knowledge. We spent quite a bit of time talking about all that was packed into that verse. So tonight we start with the fourth verse, and Ganesh is going to chant for us tonight. Ganesh, will you help us out, please?
Sure. Verse 4.
Verse 4, please.
Oh, this is cool. I can just read it off the screen. Labdhva katanchinar janmaha durlabham tatrapi pumstvam shruti paradarshanam yastvatma muktau nayateta mudhadhihi sahyatmaha swam vinihyatya sahat.
In the English, please.
Is there a man who, having somehow gained a human embodiment, and there having a masculine temperament, and also a complete knowledge of the scriptures, foolish enough not to strive hard for self-realization, he verily commits suicide, clinging to things unreal?
So we need to point out another literary technique. Last week we talked about how Shankara will put the totality of the knowledge first and the most important thing, and then after that he kind of explains it. The second literary technique I want to point out to you is if Shankara repeats an idea, it means it's really important. So in the third verse last week, he talked about how rare it is to have a human birth, how even more rare it is to have this masculine quality of head and heart. I nuanced that a little bit, and I said, well, we also need to have the feminine side as well. But you do need to have a warrior spirit. And here Shankara repeats that idea. And he says, if there's a person who has these qualities and doesn't use them to strive hard for liberation, they verily commit suicide, or they engage in self-destruction. What does he mean by this? We talk about two ways of approaching life. One is called bhoga, B-H-O-G-A. This is the path of enjoyment, and a person who practices this path is called a bhogi. It's not a golfing term, it's a Vedanta term. A bhogi wants happiness. but the way in which he or she strives for happiness is to satisfy as many desires as possible. We're going to move forward with this idea over and over again. But basically what happens is the more you get, the more you want. Who's ever made enough money? Who's ever had enough sex? Who's ever had enough validation and approval? Or all the various kinds of ego strokes that we go after. And any of us who ourselves may have struggled with it or have friends who've struggled with addiction or alcoholism or gambling or any other one of these destructive compulsions that we get into. I heard one person say that when you're a drug addict, it's like dancing with a gorilla. You don't stop until the gorilla wants to stop. So it leads us into a life where we're tyrannized by our desires. Now, in contrast to that, we have the yogi. The yogi practices yoga. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit root yuj, which means to join. It's where we get the English word yoke or union. A yogi also wants happiness, but the yogi approaches life from this viewpoint. She endeavors to reduce the number of desires entertained. Now, let me give you a real life example. So many of you know that I draw heavily from our 12-step traditions, most specifically Alcoholics Anonymous. One of the ideas, the Alcoholics Anonymous, is that the program of recovery provides us with a spiritual experience. And if you have that, the desire to drink is removed. We contrast that with a person who does what we call white knuckling it. They're using willpower to keep from drinking or using. It's usually doomed to failure. And in any case, it's certainly not very enjoyable. But anybody who's been down the road of addiction and has been freed from it through a spiritual experience where the desire has been removed, know that what's left is great freedom. It's classic yoga. It's perfect. So here Shankara is saying, if you have these qualities of head and heart, you're truly human. You have the warrior spirit. You have a good intellect. You've been exposed to the path. And instead you choose to go after the world, knock yourself out. But don't complain if your life is filled with resentment and jealousy and unmet expectations and control issues, and all the things that plague the human heart. Cause of it is a fundamental misunderstanding of where happiness is. So here Shankara says, if you have these qualities, you don't use them to strive hard for liberation. Foolishness. Foolishness. Next one, number 5. Ganesh, number 5, I think you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Ita ko vasti moodatma yastu swarte pramadhyati durlabham manusham deham prapya tatrapi paurusham. Is there a greater fool than the man who, having got the rare chance of a human birth, and there too the masculine qualities of the head and heart, falls short in his efforts to rediscover himself?
So now he said the same idea a third time. So his point is, if you are truly human, remember we talked about this last week, if you're in the realm of the gods, you're hitting all the green lights of life, you don't ask any of the profound questions. If you're in the hell realms, the realms of the hungry ghosts, can't really do much yoga from there because you're just all caught up in wanting. You have to be in that middle area, the human realm, where you can ask the question, what's it all about? Is there meaning to life? Do I have a purpose? Or is it just a rat race? Are there values? And if a person is in that human realm and has that warrior spirit, are you wasting it? Are you wasting it? So he identifies this work as the pearl of great price. Are there answers to these great, great spiritual and philosophical questions? Can a person find real peace? So he mentions it a third time now, which means he thinks this is important. Don't waste your opportunities. Now, people fall short of this for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes they'll enter the spiritual life because there's a great crisis, the death of a loved one, a near-death experience yourself, a great tragedy, you lose a job, breakup of a relationship. We suffer. So we move into the spiritual life, but we don't stick to it. Life starts to get a little bit better, and then we're off to the races again. We forget. Then maybe years and years later, we might come back, but most of us don't. So if you have the great opportunity and you come in contact with one of the great sacred traditions, Shankara says, understand that this is a moment of grace. You're being handed a gift. Don't trash it. Don't trash it. All right, next verse, number 6. Ganesh, I think you're muted again.
Yeah, looks like my internet's having some trouble. Vadantu shastrani yajantu devan kurvantu karmani bhajantu devataha atmaikya bodhena vina vimuktihi nasidhyate brahma shatantare api.
And
Let
the English?
Let erudite scholars quote all the scriptures. Let gods be invoked through sacrifices. Let elaborate rituals be performed. Let personal gods be propitiated. Yet without the experience of one's identity with the self, there shall be no liberation for the individual, not even in the lifetime of 100 Brahmas put together.
So, what is liberation? What is enlightenment? What is self-realization? What is the experience of union? Here, Shankara defines it. He says, when one experiences that the self in me and the infinite, the ground of being, which we call Brahman, are the same thing. In the tradition, we have what we call Mahavakyas. Maha means great, Vachati means to speak. So they're great utterances, great sayings. And we usually identify 4. There are more, but we identify 4 which in a shorthand describe this great non-dual philosophy. The first is Prajnanam Brahma. What is Brahman? Brahman is consciousness. It is awareness. Okay. Where is it? How do I find it? And the second one is Ayamatma Brahma. This self is Brahman. And then we're likely to say, oh, Guruji, his self is Brahman, my self is a worm. No. The third one is Tat Twamasi. You are that. And how can I be God? I have a hard enough time paying my phone bill. How can I be God? I'm a limited little person. How can I be God? And so in this third Mahavakya is implied all of the spiritual practices that we are to do. And in an auspicious time, when the mind stops, the world disappears. The student has the direct experience. The direct experience is not, oh, I'm enlightened now. Oh, I have an awakened mind. Come touch my feet. No, it's even greater. Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman. No personal sense of self is real. So this is the experience to which Shankara is pointing. Now, some people think if I study philosophy, I'm going to get it. if I read lots of scriptures and lots of commentaries. Here Shankara calls those erudite scholars. Some people think it can be obtained through ritual. Let gods be propitiated. How much puja do you have to do? And we mean all the other things, going on pilgrimages, taking safe baths. For Westerners, going to church, saying the rosary, lighting a candle, all of these various rituals. I'm not saying that they're not of value to purify us to some degree, but they, in and of themselves, will not liberate us. Only the direct experience, the self in me, and the ground of being of the entire creation are the same thing. That is termed as liberation by the wise. Next verse.
अमृतत्वस्य नाशास्ति वित्तेनेत्येव हि श्रुतिः ब्रवीति कर्मणो मुक्तेः रहेतुत्वं स्फुटं यतः. It is clear that liberation cannot be the effect of good works, for Shruti herself declares that there is no hope for immortality by means of wealth.
Yes, so good works produce artha. It produces wealth, meaning I get the results of my actions. So what we want to address here is a very important point. If you are in a room and the lights are off and it's dark, how many jumping jacks must you do in order to lighten the room? Jumping jacks won't work because jumping jacks are not opposed to darkness. If you get the vacuum cleaner out, can you vacuum up the darkness? No, because vacuuming is not opposed to darkness. Mantra. I'm going to chant Vedic mantras. Will that get rid of the darkness? No, because chanting is not opposed to darkness. How do you get rid of the darkness? Turn on the light. So what Shankara is pointing at, listen very carefully. The scriptures say, Shrunahu. Listen very carefully. The root of my problem is deep spiritual ignorance. And actions are not opposed to ignorance. Knowledge is opposed to ignorance. Let me give you an example. Okay, I'm thinking of a song lyric. How many jumping jacks do you have to do to know what the song lyric is? All right, somebody asked me what the song lyric is. One of you guys.
Yellow Submarine?
Yes! Dang! You already know it. But if you ask me and I tell you Yellow Submarine, we all live in a yellow submarine, I got to get a new lyric. Then you know the answer. So the answer to ignorance, what is contrary to ignorance, is knowledge. Not information necessarily, but knowledge. So it is the direct knowledge of my self-nature that liberates me. Now, why is this important? What's the relationship between all the spiritual practices and my liberation? Jim, should I do hatha yoga? You can. Jim, should I do puja? Should I do ritual? You can. Should I go to church? You can. Oh, I'm going to go on a pilgrimage to the Himalayas. Will that help my self-realization? You can go. All of these actions are preparatory. They serve to help purify the head and the heart. They do not, in and of themselves, liberate us. Those of you who have taken other classes know I usually use the example of slicing a ripe tomato. I had one the other night. I got this really wonderful, what do they call the ones that are all lumpy now? Heirloom tomatoes. It was really ripe. And I was going to cut it up and put it in some soup. I took my knife, cut into it, and tomato juice everywhere. Because the knife wasn't very sharp. So what do you need to do with a really ripe tomato? If you sharpen the knife first, then you can cut the tomato. So if I get my knife sharpener out, there's the tomato on the cutting board, I'm sharpening the knife. That's funny, the tomato isn't sliced yet. I keep sharpening the knife. Tomato's not sliced. Because sharpening the knife does not slice the tomato. There is a relationship. You have to sharpen the knife before you can slice the tomato. So all these spiritual practices are of value. But what do? They help sharpen my mind. They help to purify my mind. Pure mind does not mean you have goody-goody thoughts as opposed to vicious thoughts. It means you have the frequency and the volume of thought has been reduced. You have fewer thoughts. Because only a subtle intellect can engage in this process of inquiry into the self. Koham, who am I? So to sum up, what do actions do? Actions get us stuff. And that's why Shankara uses the word wealth. Actions get us stuff. But this is not about acquiring or achieving. It is a rediscovery process. In the end, it's about finding something you already are. You get something, you don't get anything new. But the lack of knowledge of who and what I am keeps me in bondage. Let me give you an example. I have a brand new iPhone 11 Pro. Very fancy. It does about the same stuff as my iPhone 6 used to do. I can make phone calls, I can listen to books, I can get messages. Once in a while, I take a picture. Can it do lots of other stuff?
That's the summary.
That's
the gist.
It does like $1,000. It better do more than that. Better camera. But I'm sure it can do all these things. But guess what? I don't know how to use it. I have to ask Puneet to fix it. I open it up and it's got 2 pages of apps on there. I don't even know what they do. I do not have the knowledge to use it. There's nothing wrong with the phone. It's operator ignorance. So also with myself. Knowledge of myself, the direct experience, frees me from fear. And finally, I know where peace is, where happiness is, where contentment is. It's myself. I thought it was out there because I was in ignorance. So Shankara says, it's not about doing, it's about realizing. Next verse.
Ato vimuktyai prayateta. Ato vimuktyai prayateta vidvan. Sanyasta bahyarta sukasprihasan. Santam mahantam samupetya deshikam. Tenopadishtartha samahitatma. Therefore, the learned seeker who is striving to gain this freedom within and who has renounced all his desires for pleasures in the sense objects should duly approach a good and generous master and must live attuned to the true significances of the words of the master.
So, if we have these qualities and we want this liberation, what should we do? So what was the first idea, Ganesh?
Renounce all your desires for pleasure in the sense objects.
No, I think before that it said it was knowledge of read it again from the top.
Therefore, the learned seeker who is striving to gain this freedom within and who has renounced all his desires for pleasures in the sense objects.
Okay, so the first thing, this learned person. Does this mean I have to learn Sanskrit and gain knowledge of all the various scriptures? Well, it helps a bit. It's not necessary. But you need to have a good bullshit detector. You need to be able to discern what's a valid means of knowledge and what is nonsense. If you go online, you're going to see all sorts of things that are called spiritual. How do I know what's the real McCoy? You need to have a little bit of understanding of what's a real wisdom tradition. Vedanta is not the only one. I actually was looking at photos before class of Guru Bawa. He was a great Sufi saint from Sri Lanka in the mid-20th century. Very much the holder of a great wisdom tradition. I have a dear friend who's part of the Mevlevi order, follower of Rumi, the whirling dervishes, another great wisdom tradition. There are many. But you need to be learned enough to know what's the real McCoy and what's a charlatan. There are basically three things that I suggest you watch out for. Do they want your money? Do they want to sleep with you? Do they want to control your life? And if you find someone who's working one of those three, run the other direction. This work cannot be bought or sold. It's outside of the marketplace. The real teacher, the Satguru, wants nothing from you. Their only joy is your liberation. So you want to be learned to some degree and want this freedom without and within, and you have to some degree renounced your desires. What do we mean by that? The yogi, and the yogi here I mean the person who's on this path, needs to see what the world can deliver and what it can't. I've started work with a student on a text called Tripura Rahasya. And in it, the main character, Parashurama, is out trying to kill all sorts of people, and he still can't quench his rage and his vengeance. Finally, he gives it up. Those of us who studied Yoga Vasishta, Lord Rama goes out and he sees what the world has to offer, and he comes back and says, it's all just empty. Everything's temporary. Why bother? The story of Siddhartha, who became the Buddha, same kind of story. Goes out in the world, sees the suffering that's there, the temporary nature of everything, and says, why should I invest in this? Why should I invest in this? So we need to have an understanding of the limitations of the world before this work will take deep root. So if you have yet to renounce all your desires, don't worry about it. At least don't embrace a rotting corpse thinking it's a beautiful bride. That's another one of Shankara's images. All right, next verse. Oh, I forgot the last part. Should find a teacher and live attuned to the deep import of what the teacher says. Find a good and generous master. This isn't someone who's going to control your life. It's interesting, in the early days, I would be with my teacher, Swami Chimayananda. And I kept saying, Swamiji, what do you want me to do? I wanted him to give me, assignments. And he would say, I have no desires. And I'd be very frustrated. And then I realized he was telling me what to do all the time. He wasn't interested in my personal life. He could have cared less. But he was telling me, watch my mind, let go of my attachments, inquire into the nature of myself, work on letting go of my reactivity. All the time he was telling me the important stuff to do. In 1994, I was in Kerala, which is in the south of India. And I hung out for 10 days at the ashram of Amaji, the hugging guru. Wonderful, wonderful saint. People came from all over India to see her. And they would get in line and wait for hours and hours and hours and hours. And they'd get up to her and they'd say, oh, should I go into business with so-and-so? Should my son marry so-and-so? They used her as a fortune teller. Now, she was generous. She gave them the best answer she could. But those are stupid questions. Questions to ask are, how can I be freed from bondage? What's my real nature? What is this world? How has it come about? Ask the important questions. Live attuned to the deep import of the teachings of the Guru. All right, next verse.
Udaredatmanatmanam magnam samsaravaridhau yogarudattamasadhya samyag darshananishthaya. Having attained the state of Yogaruda through continuous and well-established discrimination, one should lift oneself from the ocean of change and finitude wherein one has come to be drowned.
So, we have a technical term here introduced. And Shankara has borrowed this from the Bhagavad Gita. And it's yoga arudha. Arudha is a riding term. It means to mount the steed. So any of you who've ever been horseback riding, if you hold on to the bridle and you have the reins on the pommel of the saddle, and in the old-timey days, you used to put your left foot into the stirrup on the left-hand side. Now you can get on a horse on both sides. When I was learning to ride, you could only do it from the left side. And if the horse isn't well trained, it'll start to move around. And so there you are with one leg in the stirrup and the other leg kind of hopping on the ground. And you're not in control of the horse. But if you can finally swing your leg over, you're seated in the saddle, and your feet are in the stirrups, collect the reins, then you are in control of this incredibly powerful animal. You have mounted the steed. So the idea of a horse as this incredibly powerful animal that we can control is this great metaphor for the mind. So the precondition for useful work is to attain to Yoga Rudha, mounting the steed of the mind, or mounting yoga. So, what does that mean? In our minds, we have these indulgent tendencies. It's the bratty little 2-year-old inside all of us. I don't want to do that. Yeah. Or I want it now. I want it now. The little bratty 2-year-old inside of us. And what we need to do is be able to silence those voices. Let them come up, they will. But just because I feel like it doesn't mean I have to act on it. It also has an element of willingness. I need to be willing for life to be the way it is for the rest of eternity. I need to be willing to be right where I am for the rest of eternity. And I need to be willing to not have what I want for the rest of eternity. It means I have the capacity to let all that stuff go and be right here, right now. No longer the slave of my likes and my dislikes, my attachments and my aversions. This is what's called attaining to Yogarudha, mounting the steed of the mind. So here Shankara is saying this is something we need to work on a bit. Now, if you're having this thought of, oh, I'm nowhere near that, well, okay, close the book. This is not the class for me. Don't worry. Don't worry. We work at these things. We work at it. But the idea is to understand the principle. The person who's at the effect of the tyranny of their desires is not a free person. It's very interesting. Most of us fantasize, oh, what would it be like to be a trust fund kid, to have untold wealth? My experience is if a person grows up with unlimited wealth, it changes their relationships with people such that nobody ever says no. And many of these people as adults have the emotional maturity of a 2-year-old or a 4-year-old. Because they have no Yoga Rudha. They have no Yoga Rudha. So if you've had to work for everything you've gotten, and you've had to put up with crappy bosses, and you've had to deal with all the issues of an ordinary life, that's good yoga. Because you develop the capacity to attain to Yoga Arudha. mounting the steed of the mind. So Ganesh, would you read the English one more time? Do you have it in front of you? Ganesh, you're muted.
I'm not. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Okay, looks like my internet's having trouble. Having attained the state of Yoga Ruda through continuous and well-established discrimination, one should lift oneself from the ocean of change and finitude where one has come to be drowned.
Yes. So what he's saying here, it's a function of my discrimination. And we're going to go further into what we're going to define as discrimination. To be able to discern the difference between what's valuable and what's not, what's real and what's not. And here, the important thing is the student does the work. Where's the locus of the power? It's not in the guru. It's not in magic. It's not in holy water from Mother Ganga. It's in my own purushartha, my own self-effort. Now, in the end, liberation comes by grace, but we have to cooperate with grace. It's not armchair yoga. Oh, I'm just going to wait for God to enlighten me. It doesn't work that way. And it's an inner work. It's an inner work. It's an inner work. All right, next one, please. What number are we on? 10.
10. Sanyasya sarvakarmani.
We can't hear you. Did we lose you?
Man, give up all actions which are motivated by
No, we lost you. Your voice went out. Start again, please, with the Sanskrit.
Oh, the Sanskrit. Okay.
Yeah.
Sanyasya sarvakarmani bhavabandha vimuktaye yatyatam panditai dhiraih atmabhyasa upasthitaih. May the wise and learned man give up all actions which are motivated by desires and start the practice of rediscovering the self and thereby attain freedom from the bondage of birth and death.
Now, this is problematic because all actions under all circumstances are motivated by desires. What does he mean? Sannyasa sarvakaramani. Renouncing all ego-prompted desire. Meaning, if I think this action is what is necessary for me to be happy, getting what you want simply gets you what you want. And the end result is always finite and always temporary. So each of us can discern the difference between a preference, I would like chilies in my soup as opposed to none, or an insistence. I must have it this way. Where we have what I call the I'll be happy when. It'll be better if. More, better, different, in order to be happy. The yogi wants to understand that those kinds of desires and the actions that produces them, you know, it isn't going to fix the problem. We have a God-shaped hole in our hearts, and no amount of stuff is going to fill it up. So, do your duty in the world. If you've got a job, work hard at your job, strive hard for excellence. If you're in a marriage, a relationship, you have a significant other, stay in it and be kind. Treat your spouse or your significant other as an incarnation of the divine, etc. If you've got children, you have a duty to be caring for your children. We're not saying that you need to give up any of this stuff. But if you think, if my daughter becomes a doctor, then the neighbors were going to think we're important. Any of you have parents who have those kind of thoughts? All of that stuff is vanity. It's like grass that's burnt, blown away. So here Shankara is saying, do your duty in the world, but give up this idea that getting what I want is what's going to make me happy, give my life meaning, and instead devote yourself to rediscovery of your essential nature. Why not go for something real? Why not go for something that can deliver real serenity, real peace of mind, real joy? This is what the scriptures say. This is what the great saints say. So far, I found it to be true. I'm going to have some faith in that. All right. Was that number 10 that we just did?
Mhm.
Okay, so we'll start with 11 next week. We have time now for questions. Anyone have any questions? Just unmute yourself and ask. Anybody left out there?
Everyone's online.
I just want to comment, Jim.
Please.
I remember when you were explaining this the first time last time that we read Vivekachoodamani, and I remember you saying something like, if we put clay ornaments into the oven, we're gonna get clay ornaments baked, but like we were expecting, like I normally would be expecting gold ornaments. And I don't know what I'm trying to say, but, and then you say also back then that if we have all green lights and then all of a sudden we don't, and then we start acting like brats, right? With the
Yeah.
But there's also this, I guess, trauma from childhood that it's very in my blind spot. it's just I'm not really aware, and it just blinds me, and then I end up doing the same, repeating the same patterns, and I don't know.
No, it's a very good point. And it again depends on how much inner work we've done. But the one axiom that I would give you, and this is so important, it is a spiritual axiom that if I'm upset, if I'm disturbed, no matter the cause, I'm the one with the attachment, the expectation, the identification. That doesn't mean that the world and its people aren't oftentimes quite wrong. They are. But if I'm upset, if I'm disturbed, even if it's from trauma from childhood, it's my issue. And if ego says the problem is out there, the problem is my husband, the problem is my daughter, the problem is my job, the problem is politics, the problem is somebody else, we have no chance of getting any serenity. It's always my job to deal with it. I have to learn how to tell the truth about it and then let it go. It's always about letting go and keeping your heart open. And that's easy to say and a challenge to do.
And I practiced it. I mean, at the beginning, I was just thinking, wow, there's got to be an exception to that rule or that axiom. And then I've been changing parts, I mean, significant parts in my life, but there are still some. So this is just like, it goes in layers, right? Like, it feels like I'm filing something or sanding something, that like layers and layers and layers and layers and layers. And
yes. Yes. But it is axiomatic, meaning it's always true. If I'm upset, if I'm disturbed, if I'm angry,
it is
I'm the one with the problem.
And is it really just to be able to be with it? And in this, now with this ACA stuff that I'm working on, it says just like, okay, be with the memory and feel the feelings. Is it really just feel the feeling? It's just like, I still kind of refuse to just cry over it. Is it, I mean, of course I write, I colored, and it just feels.
At some point when you feel you're done with it, you can know that it happened. We don't pretend that these traumas didn't happen. But at some point you forgive all the people of the past, because they're just human beings who are suffering.
Yeah.
Hurt people.
Yeah. And I think I'm past that. I think is that there's enough compassion. This the conditioning. I can't blame them for the conditioning to teach me Spanish, because that's where I learned. That's the language they knew, and that's the language they taught me. I'm beyond that, I think. But why is it still something in there?
It's in there till it's not in there. We don't get to choose. Some people have more damage than others. But you can get through it, Cicely. You can, I promise you.
Thank you, Jim.
But the human mind is labyrinthian. I've known people who go back and they deal with all their childhood trauma, and then the next thing they do is they want to deal with the trauma of prior lifetimes. I mean, there's no end. There's no end. In the end, when you've gotten enough relief, you can start to renounce the mind itself. You quit believing your mind.
Okay.
And only you can decide, okay, enough.
Okay. Well, that's a consolation. That's hope. Thank you, Jim.
Very good question. Very good question. And your intuition will lead you into what you need to do. So if you find that you are led to do ACA work, by all means, trust your intuition. Someone else may say, oh, I've just been led to chant Lalita Sahasranam. If that's what you're led to do, trust it. You want to study Sri Vidya rituals, trust your intuition. You know, you'll know what you need to do. The real guru is always within. It's yourself in the end.
Thank you, Jim.
Anybody else have a question? All right, we'll meditate.